So this is additional information that's not in the textbook, but I feel really passionate and really important that we talk about the Reconstruction era, this era after the Civil War. And as we address this, I want to be sensitive because this is a really challenging time within our nation. A lot of injustices were done, and at the end, we're going to ask a question that I don't know the answer to. There will be pictures and there'll be graphics that might be sensitive, but I think it's important to show kind of what was happening in our nation after the Civil War, because the freeing of the slaves did not solve the issue of racism and of subjugation of individuals based on their race. So let's start with the important legal decisions. So the first is the Emancipation Proclamation. This is 1863. This is in the middle of the Civil War. And this freed slaves in rebel states. So any state in rebellion or any territory in rebellion against the United States, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in those states. The next one comes also during the Civil War, the 13th Amendment. Lincoln felt it was very important to pass this during the war because he was unsure if they'd be able to ratify this post-war. And this is important, is that this is what freed slaves in the entire United States and her territories. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in the northern states, but the 13th Amendment did. The 14th Amendment provides equal protection of the laws to all citizens. And that's really important, is before that wasn't necessarily the case. And so this equal protection clause in the first section is used throughout history now, and even presently today, to see, do laws provide equal protections to individuals in the United States? That's section 1. Section 2 gets rid of the 3/5 rule. And so section 2 says that we're going to count everybody in the United States, in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. And so again, maintain the Native American sovereignty. But this would now count everybody as a single individual. In sections 3 and 4, section 3 says rebels cannot serve in federal government, that if you were a rebel or insurrectionist, you cannot serve. Now they could overrule that with 3/4 vote. And number 4 says money will not be given, or reparations will not be given to anybody who lost money or capital as a result of freeing of slaves. So we're not going to repay those slaveholders that lost great amounts of wealth through the freeing of slaves. The 15th Amendment, this should say 1870, I apologize, in 1870 gave the right to vote to everyone based on the color or race or conditions of servitude. And then the last important legal decision. So these were all ones that built up the legal rights of blacks in the United States. This 1896 ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson, we talked about it earlier, this actually now is a major step backwards. Plessy wanted to sit on a rail car that was designed for whites. Plessy was 7/8 white. That means one of his great-grandparents was black. As a result, they ruled that he was black, and they said in the court ruling that a law that is created separate but equal was constitutional. So by having 2 rail cars, one for whites, one for coloreds, was legal because they were separate but equal. And this led to to a lot of justification for segregation and what are known as Jim Crow laws. And so here's just a summary of those important legal decisions. Again, the 15th Amendment was in 1870. There's this notion of 40 acres and a mule. And I encourage you, click on this. It'll take you to an article and a brief thing that you can listen to about 40 acres and a mule. So this is William T. Sherman's, called Special Field Order number 15, where he promised that as he went through the South and evicted, if you will, or kicked out the slave owners off of those lands through his march, he said there's now all this land unoccupied. All those black soldiers who fight for the Union, that fight for the United States, we promise you 40 acres. And the hope was also to provide them a mule. And so that is what they fought for. So when they fought, they had this promise that they would be given 40 acres and a mule. And so that's why they fought. After the Civil War, they then go to redeem this promise. And it's President Andrew Johnson, the successor of Lincoln, who then rescinds this. And so they fought with this promise that they would get 40 acres of land of their own. And immediately it's rescinded. So where did these free slaves go? So they couldn't go to their own land because they were then because the U.S. government said we're not going to give you your own land. So they became sharecroppers. And now sharecropping is different than tenant farming. So tenant farming was very common in the South among poorer white individuals. And what tenant farming is when you own the tools yourself and you're just renting the land. Sharecropping is slightly different. The land and the tools are all owned by the owner, and the workers don't own that. And so they are sharing in the crop. They work the land, then the crop goes to market, and they share a percentage of the proceeds with those that were working. A lot of injustices happened. Oftentimes they were promised 15 cents per pound sold. And when the owner would come back, they'd say, all I can give you is 5 cents. And so a lot of injustices go that was designed to take advantage and to extract the resources from these recently freed slaves. But the majority of slaves stayed in the South trying to work their own land, hoping to earn enough money to one day being able to buy their own land. Now, it's also important to note about these important legal decisions. This is the 13th Amendment. Again, it frees slavery. It's the emancipation of all slaves in the United States. But it has this clause, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Using this, the South begins to establish what they call black codes. These are restrictive laws passed after the Civil War to limit freedoms of African Americans. So examples of this, it was illegal to be unemployed. So these are called vagrancy laws. And so you needed to have on your person, on yourself, a written contract of evidence of employment. Well, in order to get one of these, you had to sign yearly contracts. And so they'd sign these yearly contracts, they'd get it, and that then required them to work for that employer for a year. They couldn't change employers during that year. And that was challenging. If you didn't have that piece of paper, or if you didn't have proof of employment, or even if you didn't have a job, they could arrest you, and part of your sentence would be to go work on farms. It became illegal for black people to hold other jobs other than farmers unless they paid an annual tax. So this was in South Carolina. That in order to work another job, you had to pay a large tax. They couldn't afford this. These are large sums of money back then. And so it required them to work in these farms. They also had what they called anti-enticement laws. And so if I was a very productive worker for one farmer and was in a yearly contract, it was illegal for another farmer to hire me outside of that contract or to even offer me higher wages. And so as a result, it locked in these workers into these jobs, and it made it incredibly exploitive of these workers in these black workers. And these were called black codes, laws that were very that were not enforced equally among whites and blacks, but designed specifically to make blacks criminals and to cause them to commit crimes where they could then put them to work. So the notion here is you break the law, you go to jail. It was legal then, once you went to jail, to require you to work on farms. And so I encourage you to watch this video here in the PowerPoints that talks about some of these laws. And so I encourage you to do that on your own. When we talk about the right to vote, now that the blacks were counted as a sole person, there was more representation in the South. And so there's this opportunity for Souths to go to the polls now that they have the right to vote and to vote for representation. However, there was a lot done to try to limit their ability to vote. Specifically, poll taxes were implemented as a source of revenue for states. That was the political argument for them. Let's have a poll tax to raise money for states. Now, poll taxes weren't new. They were very common, especially in England and in the colonies at the time. So it wasn't like this was a new idea. They just reinstated this, but it came with a specific clause that targeted minorities, specifically black. It had a grandfather clause. So if you voted prior to 1865, you didn't have to pay this tax. Well, it turns out blacks couldn't vote before 1865. It was against, the amendment had not been passed yet. And so this allowed whites to vote for free and blacks had to pay to vote. Even though they had the right to vote, work was done to try to suppress their vote. And it worked. It really did suppress their vote, that they were not able to do this. It wasn't until 1915 that this was ruled unconstitutional. Slight variations continue this practice till 1939. And then finally, it was in 1964 that the 24th Amendment passed that made it illegal to use a poll tax. So we see this going on for almost 100 years, that for blacks to vote, they had to pay money. For whites, they did not have to. And that was a major challenge, that even though the blacks had the rights to vote, they weren't able to actually vote. Voter suppression was very much in force in the Reconstruction era. There's stories of great atrocities, specifically atrocities trying to steal land legally and illegally from blacks who were able to buy land. So an example in Kentucky, 50 hooded white men surrounded the home of David Walker. He was black, and they ordered him out of the house to give him a whooping. Now, there was no legal reason. He wasn't under arrest, but these hooded men stood there, and so he refused, and in self-defense, he shot at them. Well, these hooded men set his house afire. They threw flames at his house caught on fire. When his family ran out, they began to shoot. It killed Walker, his wife, and one of his children. Another child never made it out of the burning house. So this great atrocity, no one was charged with the killings. And so now you have 3 orphan children that go away. What to do with this land? Well, that land was given to a neighbor who then was able to legally sell it and profit from this land. That is just one example in Kentucky. Another example in Alabama, and this is in 1964. The state of Alabama sued Lemon Williams and Lawrence Hudson, 2 cousins, claiming that the 2 40-acre farms that they lived on and had lived on, their families had lived on, belonged to the state. So they were able to show deeds, mortgages, tax records that their ancestors bought this land in 1874. However, going to the court system, the judge ruled that the family had to leave the land. So in the ruling, further as they evaluated this, internal memos and letters on this case, the reason why the judge did this was because of the race of these 2 individuals. Again, legally evicting this family who had legally owned the land for almost 100 years because of their race. An example in Mississippi, Isaac Simons owned a 140-acre farm. It was sold from him for non-payment of taxes. Now, audits of this show that he did indeed pay taxes on some of the property, but he was behind on some of the property. And so when the land was taken from him, he hired an attorney to file suit to regain his land. A mob of men came and took Simmons and his son to a deserted road. They began to beat them. After they beat them, they said, "You have 10 days to leave town," and let the 2 men leave. As they were leaving, Simmons was shot 3 times in the back. His land then was never given back to his family, but was then transferred to a new ownership. In Florida, the Espy family owned 147 acres and had a fruit grove, 2 houses, and 30 lots that they could develop. The government used eminent domain to acquire the land for the Navy airfield. This was right before World War II. The family was paid $8,000. They took to court saying that this was not a fair market price, and the court, predominantly white, ordered that they be rewarded $13,000. That $13,000 was 1/6 of the price that their white neighbors received as part of the same project. Now, at the end of World War II, the Navy didn't need this airfield anymore, and the Espys asked to buy it back. And the Navy said no. They gifted it to the city. They gave it free to the city, who then was able to sell it, and they've sold it. The Dodger Spring Training Facility is located currently on that land. The portion of that land was recently sold for $10 million. These are examples of legal and illegal ways that blacks who legally own land were moved off of their land. Another common practice was to burn courthouses. Legal documents were kept in courthouses. And so by burning these courthouses, the legal documents would go away. An example of this was Jasper County, Mississippi, that burned the courthouse and the documents disappeared. So a white farmer would come and say, this is my land. And the black people living there said, no, this is our land. They would go to court, and the court then would rule in favor of the white owners. And so land was legally taken by burning these court documents to get rid of the evidence of ownership. One of these, as they went back to the burnt courthouse, they're able to find evidence that part of this land, 204.5 acres, were acquired from black owners. They were driven off by the KKK and through the land acquisition. Later, as they followed what happened with these 204.5 acres, among that land in Jasper County, 850,000 barrels of oil has been pumped from that property. So this is generational wealth that is being stolen from blacks after the Civil War, up until the 1960s. Just to show the tenor, here is a picture of August 3rd, 1920 in Center, Texas. Here you see the lynching of a 16-year-old boy. These injustices weren't just the Civil War. They continued into the 1900s, and they continued to be so bad, so devastating, that it led to what's known as the Great Migration. Starting in 1916, 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South to the North. They looked to urban areas where there was jobs, where there's economic opportunities, where they hoped they would get away from the racism that haunted and terrorized them. They looked to these for land of opportunities. Unfortunately, these were not the land of opportunities that they hoped for, because also after the Civil War, many whites also from the South also migrated to the North, and there was many large sentiments of discrimination and racism still. Banks would explicitly not lend out money to blacks. So as blacks went and got jobs in factories and industrial jobs and making money, and they went to buy homes, they couldn't actually get lending from a bank to do so. And so they had to turn to non-traditional loans, to what we call predatory lenders. One of these examples was what's called on contract. It is a private lender would allow the individual to buy the home and make monthly payments on the home. But the deed was kept by the lender, and the deed was not granted until the entire loan was paid off. Now, if you tried to sell, the contract was such that you couldn't sell your home halfway through. You never built equity in the home. The money you gave the lender was not as building off and paying off the home. And anytime you missed a payment were grounds for eviction. And there's many stories of people who became millionaires because they would continue to buy these homes. They'd let blacks into the homes on these on-contract predatory loans. And once they missed a payment, they would evict them, keeping all those payments for themselves. In this time period in Chicago, 85% of all blacks in Chicago who bought homes on contract. A very predatory lending opportunity. But in the United States in 1936, part of the New Deal was the Federal Housing Administration. This was designed to try to make home buying more affordable in the United States. So the FHA loans, which existed today, they required lower down payments and were for longer terms for up to 30 years, so it could be a lower monthly payment, which allowed individuals to be able to afford to buy a home. But part of the FHA loan process was that neighborhoods were rated based on stability, and they were given a color rating. And so redlining were these neighborhoods that were identified too unstable to qualify for an FHA loan. And so when you look at Chicago, you look at these red areas, what's known as redlining, these are the neighborhoods that are predominantly black. So as individuals who are black tried to move into these predominantly black neighborhoods, they could not qualify for an FHA loan. There was not opportunities for them to gain access to capital to buy their homes. Now, as a result, they couldn't even borrow money to renovate their homes or to make their homes better. So we begin to see these homes and an era of decrepit homes and of lower home values and building of these really bad neighborhoods. And a lot of it was this policy not allowing blacks to have access to capital to buy homes. But it wasn't just homes. The New Deal left African Americans out of many different things. The Social Security and unemployment insurance excluded farm workers and domestics, which were heavily occupied by blacks. In 1935, about 65% of African Americans nationally, and 70 to 80% of blacks in the South were ineligible for Social Security and unemployment insurance. The GI Bill aimed to give veterans low-interest home loans, but they had to be low-interest home loans. But blacks couldn't qualify for low-interest home loans, so those blacks who fought in World War II and came back could not take advantage of the GI Bill designed to give them home ownership. And it continues today. In 2008, the housing crisis. This was the subprime housing crisis. Blacks were predominantly targeted to offer subprime loans. They focused on neighborhoods and other individuals. And when they did give blacks loans, they steered them into these subprime loans, even if they qualified for better interest rate loans. They also charged them additional fees. On average, blacks were paying 5 to 11% more per month in their mortgage. And so when the crash came, blacks were disproportionately foreclosed on in their homes. It turns out that the Justice Department investigated this, and they found that more than 200,000 African-American borrowers who qualified for loans were charged higher fees or placed into subprime loans. Bank of America settled to pay $335 million. Wells Fargo agreed to pay $175 million. This discrimination against blacks and the ability to buy homes continues today. And why is this important? Well, we mentioned this book a little bit earlier. This is Capital by Thomas Piketty. And in it, Piketty argues that the income inequality that we see in our country is driven by those people who own capital, those people who own machines, who own factories, companies. Their wealth is growing much more. Jeff Bezos, their wealth is growing much more than anybody else. And he argues those who own capital will grow faster than normal people based on economic growth. But one of the criticisms is it's not just owning capital as a company. It's owning capital in terms of home ownership. That what leads to economic inequality over time is those people who have access to buy homes. And just to show you what's happening in my lifetime of home values here in Salt Lake City. So if you would have bought, when I was born, around 1980, a home for $40,000, today that home is worth 8 times as much, right? $320,000. Even if you're looking in your lifetime, in the past couple of years, if you would have bought a home in 2012 for $170,000, it's almost doubled in value. The ability to gain wealth from home ownership is enormous. But historically, since the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era and through today, blacks have been excluded from this market. They've been excluded from being able to build their wealth through home ownership. When we talk about land of opportunities, there's one example that stands out maybe more above any others. So O.W. Gurley purchased 40 acres of land outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was designed to build a community for blacks. It was known as Greenwood. And Greenwood began to thrive. Part of this is because of segregation. Blacks who moved there, who could buy homes there, sold to them from Gurley. They built businesses and they shopped their businesses and they became incredibly prosperous. They didn't have to shop in Tulsa because they couldn't shop in Tulsa. And they became so prosperous that they became much wealthier than those white neighborhoods and neighboring communities in Tulsa. This became known as Black Wall Street. The population grew immensely. In 1910, there was 18,000 people in Greenwood. By 1920, there was 90,000 people in Greenwood. This was a thriving area that showed that blacks, if given the opportunity, could become entrepreneurs, could own businesses, could experience exponential economic growth. But there was a lot of bad sentiment that many of the whites, through their racism, did not want the blacks to have this kind of opportunity. And there was a lot of tensions at this time period. And these tensions led to what's known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. This animosity grew. And there was one small event that triggered this. Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white woman. Now, it's unclear exactly what happened. But from firsthand accounts and those that were nearby witnessed, is as Dick Rowland walked into an elevator, he tripped, and to stop his fall, he reached out and he grabbed the arm of a white woman. She began to scream. Dick was frightened, and he ran away. She accused him of assaulting her. Immediately, Dick was arrested. While in jail, the Tulsa Tribune wrote an article, racially charged, talking about the horrendous assault that Dick Rowland had committed against this young white woman. Violence broke out. 200 men surrounded the courthouse and demanded that Dick Rowland be released to their vigilante justice. Then, knowing this, blacks from Greenwood showed up to help defend the courthouse to ensure that Dick Rowland would get his day in court. There was a struggle. Based on records of what happened, it's unclear, but records show that a white man grabbed a gun of a black man and that gun went off. Hearing that gun go off, shots were exchanged between both parties. The black individuals there were really greatly outnumbered, so they retreated to Greenwood. Whites then began to gather that very night to arm a militia to attack Greenwood. The sheriff, the police department, deputized many of the civilians, the gun-owning civilians, making them police officers. They can go and arrest and even shoot the individuals in Greenwood. A militia marched against Greenwood. They set it to a fire. They prevented the fire departments from trying to go set out the fires. 35 square blocks were destroyed. 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. This was a 2-day riot, not a riot of black individuals, but a riot of the whites against Black Wall Street. An opportunity was given them to fight against the wealth and the prosperity that Greenwood experienced. 2 days after the riots, the mayor proposed to buy all the land, all the destroyed land from the black individuals at a much discounted rate because, of course, their land was destroyed, to build an industrial complex. This was a travesty. But it didn't stop there. A cover-up continued. These homeless blacks were arrested and they were placed and deported into internment camps throughout Oklahoma. Victims were buried in unmarked graves. The police records vanished. No one knows what happened to the police records of the deputization of these individuals. The Tulsa Tribune cut out the articles that incited this violence before they were transferred to microfilm. In fact, it was prohibited to teach about this in public schools in Oklahoma. And it wasn't until 2020 that it was allowed to be included in the curriculum. This kind of event epitomizes what had happened since the Reconstruction era. And so I ask a question. Should reparations be provided? You may have heard this question, but I want to propose it in a slightly different way. Should reparations be provided to World War II Jews? Think of the Jews, identified for their religious views, for their ethnicity, hunted down, evicted from their lands, taken to concentration camps, killed. The atrocities that the Nazis and the Third Reich did against these Jews was immense. After the World War II, Germany, West Germany specifically, and the nation of Israel got into talks about reparations. It was agreed upon in 1952 that Germany would pay the reparations of the damages caused. The Prime Minister of Israel said, so that the murderers do not become the heirs as well. Because those that killed the Jews also then got their land, got their houses, got their businesses. And so Germany agreed to pay 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks, or about $7 billion today, to Israel for the damages done over a 12-year period. These reparations led to the development of a stable economy in Israel. 1/3 of the total investment in the electrical system was made possible by the reparation payments from Germany. 1/2 of their investment in the railroad system was made possible by the payments of the reparations from Germany. Their gross national product, goods produced strictly in Israel, not any imports, but goods produced in Israel, tripled during that 12-month period. That reparations from Germany to the Jews that were now living in Israel was able to fundamentally change their future. And now Israel is a very stable, thriving economy with a national GDP per capita at over $40,000. And so now I propose that question that you may be thinking. Should reparations be provided to African Americans? Now, the first thing we should ask and be able to answer is yes or no. And if we answer yes, then the next question is hard, is how do we go about doing this? And so this is actually a hard question, and there's a lot of really interesting articles, and I'll post those that talk about how do we go about doing this. Should we provide reparations to those people who were brought over from Africa and sold into slavery? Well, there's precedent that this happened in Massachusetts, and that the state of Massachusetts paid a slave who was brought over from Ghana back in the colonial period. But I would even venture is maybe we don't go back as far as this as slavery yet. There are things in our recent past. We know deeds and land was owned by specific individuals. We know of these acts that they were robbed of those lands. There are things we could do with documented evidence to provide some reparations. So I don't know the answer to this. I don't know how to go about doing it. I don't know the dollar amount to be given. But I do want to encourage you to think about the atrocities that this group of individuals went through, not just the slavery, but in the Reconstruction era and through today because of the color of their skin. And think about how we might give them an opportunity to excel economically, like many other Americans have.